Hello, this is a video about the Olympus OMD EM-1 Mk camera and the AEL button. The camera manual I find a bit impenetrable, to be honest. This is all controlled by the gear menu, so it's the sub menu A1 from the gear menu in the camera, and I'll show you this on the camera in a minute. But it says here for single autofocus, continual autofocus, manual focus and starry sky autofocus, the menu can be used to control the focus or the metering operation performed. This used either with the shutter button or the AEL button. And I'm shortening the actual label on the button is AEL AFL, but for the purpose of this video I'll just shorten it to the AEL button. It's the button on the back of the camera, which I'll show you in a moment. It presents a table. The manual actually presents a table which had me really confused, because it talks about different modes for different autofocus settings, and I'll show you the table. It's here. I can't make any sense of that, and I don't know if that makes any sense to any of you either. So I thought I'd do this video really just to help me remember what all these different options and settings are. Just a reminder that auto exposure lock, the AEL button, really is only to be used with the camera's auto exposure settings. So the camera has different modes. If you want complete control over exposure, you would select manual mode, and if you want the camera to help you, you would choose one of the auto exposure modes. So that would be program auto, aperture priority and shutter priority. So I'm going to go into the menu system. It's menu A1, and off the gear menu, then A1, and then it's the third option down, AEL. Okay, so what was confusing me was all these modes. So if I look at single autofocus and that option there, you can see mode 1, mode 2, mode 3. What do they all mean? Well, fortunately, the camera screen here does tell you what these things mean, but may not be that obvious on first look. But before we do that, why do we need auto exposure at all, and when does it come into play? Well, it comes into play when we're in the program auto, the aperture priority and the shutter priority modes. And as you can see, I'm here in aperture priority because there's a little A in the corner. So all of these modes have auto exposure as a built-in camera function. So they try and help you to get the right exposure for your image. The trouble with the camera helping you with exposure is that sometimes it gets it wrong, and it can get it wrong in scenes where there is a lot of contrast, and what you want to do is expose in one of the sort of highlights or the darker areas of the scene so that they're correctly exposed, and bring out some of the detail that might otherwise be hidden by the camera's decision making. So I'm just going to have a look at what metering mode I'm in. So if I go down to the metering mode options, you can see I'm in spot metering mode, and I'm using spot metering mode in this instance because I want to illustrate the difference between the reflected light from the lighter subjects in the scene compared to the darker subjects in the scene. So our exposure is actually tied in with our focus point. So here you can see I'm focusing on the lighter character in the scene, and it's giving me a meter reading of 1/5 of a second shutter speed. So the exposure is set by me as at f5.8, and during this video I'm not going to change that. That's what I've set as my aperture. That's the aperture that I would like to use for this scene. Let's go back to the menu options and then look at what they are telling me. So what you see on the first page of this menu here is really what you've got currently set. So S relates to single autofocus, C relates to continuous autofocus, M relates to manual autofocus, and the star in square brackets relate to starry sky autofocus. And the number after each one of those, so S1 means that it's in mode 1, and when I change that you'll see that it changes to S2. But let's first have a look at what mode 1 gives us. Well, this screen tells us really, it's telling us that a half press on the shutter button will lock the exposure and set the autofocus point. A full press will take the picture, and if I wanted to use the AEL button, that would also give me an exposure lock. The difference is that if I half press on the shutter button, I have to keep my finger down on the shutter button to lock the exposure. If I just use it for the focusing and take my finger off, it won't lock the exposure. The exposure will change to whatever the scene demands. So let's just have a look at that in operation. So I'm using the shutter button. I've given it a half press. By adding an extra light source, you can see that the exposure has still remained at f5, whereas if I release my finger off the shutter button, you can see that it's now giving me a meter reading of 1/15. I'm going to turn the light source off just to go back to my original exposure setting of 1/5 of a second, and if I press the AEL button now, I've pressed it and released it. So what you can see now is that the AEL lock button icon shows on the screen just above the aperture priority symbol in the left hand corner. Now if I increase the light source, what happens is the scene brightens up, but the exposure stays the same. That's because I've locked the exposure using that AEL button. Take the picture, and that's at f1/5 of a second, f5.8. As I said, that's the setting I'm not going to change. So I'm going to remove that light source. So that's mode 1. Let's have a look at what the other modes are. As I said, that's reflected in that line there, S1, C1, M1, star 1. So let's have a look at what mode 2 offers us. Mode 2, so half press on the shutter button just sets the focus, and pressing the AEL button now locks the exposure, so locks the exposure as it did with mode 1. So don't forget to press the OK button to set that and lock that in to mode 2. So now when I go back to my scene, I'm going to set the focus on that point there, and if you remember, that's giving me 1/5 of a second. If you remember when I turned the light source on last time, what happened was that the exposure was locked. But this time, because I'm in mode 2, the exposure isn't locked, and it's now giving me an exposure reading of 1/15 of a second rather than 1/5 of a second, because it hasn't locked the exposure. Okay, so let's have a look at what the AEL button does in mode 2. So if I press the AEL button, that's now locked in at 1/5 of a second. So when I increase the light source, instead of giving me 1/15, it stays at 1/5. I can still take that photograph. So I'm going to remove the light source, and it still stays at that because I've still got the AEL button. So I've only pressed it once and then released it. It gives me, a finger free, or I don't have to worry about holding onto a button while I recompose my image if I choose to do that. So I'm going to remove the lock from that by pressing the AEL button. Let's go back to the menu and have a look at what mode 3 gives me. So mode 3 can be used for what they call back button focus, which means that mode 3 means that the half press on the shutter button does what it did in mode 1, so it'll lock the exposure and also give me a focus point, lock the focus in. But the AEL button now will only operate the focusing. So let's press OK to set that in motion. So I'm going to go back to my scene. I'm going to use the shutter button half press. So if you remember in mode 3, that also locks the exposure. So at 1/5 of a second now, increasing the light source, and it remains at 1/5 of a second. That's mode 3. So if I remove, well, let's leave that as 1/15 of a second. If I press the AEL button now, I focused on that character on the right, removing the light source does change the shutter speed, so it hasn't locked the exposure. If you only want that shutter button to take a photograph, well, you can see there's another option that it can be used in conjunction with. So halfway autofocus is currently operative. I can turn that off by going to inoperative. So this means now I'm half pressing on the shutter button and nothing's happening. And just to illustrate that, I'm going to change my focus point to the character at the back. And you can see that half press on the shutter button isn't changing any of the focus. If I press the AEL button, now it has. I can still, if I release the AEL button, it's like the half press on the shutter button. Now the focus is not locked. So let's lock the focus and take the shot. That's giving me 2.5 of a second. And that change in meter reading there is because I'm now using auto exposure lock on a darker subject. So the way that the camera and the metering system in the camera works is it tries to convert the whole scene or the spot that you're focusing on, in this case because I'm using spot metering. It tries to sort of go to 18% grey, which means that where you've got something light in the scene, like something white, it will try and make that grey, so it will make that look a bit darker. And the same with blacks, it will try and make blacks in the scene lighter, because that's what it does when it tries to get to a 18% grey. So let's just see that and what you can do about that. So I'm going to go to mode 1 so that the exposure can be locked. So here we go, mode 1. So the AEL button now is helping me because it's locking the exposure in. So I'm looking at that character that's it's kind of not really white, but let's imagine it's white. The problem is if I lock that exposure, it doesn't look that white to me. So what can I do about that? The front dial helps by allowing me to use something called exposure compensation. So in my scene now, if I turn the dial to the right, I'm actually adding some exposure compensation to my image, which is lightening that white character in my scene. And you can see that by turning that dial, you can see it's now saying +1 here, and this is the scale, the exposure compensation scale. So I'm adding a stop of exposure to the image, even though the exposure, the auto exposure is locked to 2.5 of a second. I can go the other way, of course, if I turn the dial to the right, to the left rather. It's now giving me sort of underexposed, so it's underexposing that to one stop. So it means that you can adjust the darkness or the lightness of colours in your scene by using auto exposure compensation.